Three Bible verses we want to deal with today. If you've got your Bibles there, open up at Genesis chapter 1. Which I know has caught some of you by surprise since we're talking about creation, but be that as it may. Genesis chapter 1. And have a look at verse 31. Okay, now true story, while you're finding your place in chapter 1 of Genesis, I was on my way to America a year or so ago, and the date was September the 10th. Does that ring a bell? Guess how many Americans there weren't on the plane? It was almost empty. But there was one young American who'd come to Australia, and he was on his way back from a surfing holiday. Well, it wasn't as good a holiday as he'd hoped, because he got to Australia, had heard about our beautiful golden beaches, our fabulous looking young ladies, and the beautiful curved waves, right? And so he'd got there, he'd hired a surfboard, he'd swum out to the furthest wave, turned around and went to come back in, and underneath him was a big, streamlined, grey shape. And it opened its mouth and it had hundreds of teeth this big. And he said, I swam back to the beach and I never went back in the water again. By the way, what do you think he saw? Shark, that's right. We've got lots of sharks in Australia. And it wasn't just the word shark that he was worried about. He was worried that it actually didn't have its mouth open to say good day. It was going to shut its mouth over him, and that would significantly shorten both his surfboard and his lifespan. And he didn't think that would be very good. Have a look at Genesis chapter 1, please, verse 31. You see, we don't live in the world that's described in Genesis 1 anymore. In verse 31 it says, God saw all that he'd made, and behold, it was very. And I'll be honest, most of the American churches I go to, they read that as a moral verse. But it's an everything verse. I mean, question, do you think Adam was worried about the size of the sharks in the little pond in the Garden of Eden? I say size deliberately because how do you think that young man would have felt? You see, I dig up lots of fossils all around the world. How do you think he would have felt if he ran into a shark that big? I mean, I watched a television program, you know, one of your Discovery type channel programs, and they had a fossil tooth just like this. And they said, here's the evidence. The title of the show, by the way, was Jurassic Shark. Isn't that a clever play on words? And they said, look, the evidence tells us, because we know what sort of a shark this is, it still lives off the coast of Australia today, but its teeth are this big. Sharks used to be monsters. Now they're midgets. And by the way, a 20-foot midget is still got to be taken into consideration if you're surfing. They said they used to be monsters 50 to 60 feet long. Now they're midgets. Look how much they've evolved. And I scratched my head and I thought, I don't think they've used the right word. Okay, but what was the young man worried about? Well, he didn't live in a world that was very good, did he? And the shark wasn't exactly going to be friendly to him. Sharks in Australia are not noted for that. Okay, Genesis 1:31, God saw everything he made, and behold, it was very good. Okay, now go to 1 Thessalonians Chapter 5. You see, the funny thing is, I became a Christian through reading a book by an atheist, which I'm told is not normal. But anyway, this atheist was poking fun at anybody who believed in God, and he had all these arguments as to why there was no God. And if you're any sort of science student at all, you know one thing. It's easy to prove something exists. It's impossible to prove something doesn't exist. You can prove a positive, but you can't prove an absolute negative. And all of a sudden it struck me, I'd held this guy way up here in high regard for his academic prowess. The man was a fool. He just proved it in his chapter on how there isn't a God. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 verse 21. Don't know what version you're reading, but if it's King James, it'll be prove all things. If it's NIV, it'll be test all things. And yet you live in America in which people think this is a religious book and you believe it by blind faith, and if you want to do testing, you're involved in science. And science is to deal with facts, and faith is to deal with fantasy and imagination. I know this because I spend a lot of time in your high schools. And the average public high schooler out there not only has no idea what's in the Bible, they think religion and fantasy and fiction and faith are over there, and fact and science and evidence and hard proof are over here. They get a shock when you say, listen to 1 Thessalonians Chapter 5 verse 21. Prove all things. Test all things. By the way, have you ever thought of this question? What would the evidence be that the world started out very good? It's a good question, and you only get the answers to the questions that you ask. And if you don't ask the right questions, don't expect the right answers. You see, the devil's in the business of stopping America asking the right questions, and they'll never have a hope of getting to the right answers. So let's go a little bit further. What would the evidence be that the world started out very good and somehow it's come downhill to where we are today? What would the proof of that be? How would you test it? Last verse for the moment. Go to Numbers, chapter 13. Being theological students, you probably didn't even need to look this up. You could quote it in Hebrew. But if you can't, have a look at verse 23 in English. The context, of course, is Moses has sent the spies into the land of Canaan. And in verse 23, they're getting their report ready. And it says, they came to the brook of Eshcol and cut down from there a branch with one bunch of grapes, and 2 of them carried it away upon a staff. Anything strike you as unusual about that verse? There's 2 options, isn't there? Either the people of Israel were pygmies, and it took 2 of them to carry one bunch of grapes, or else the grapes were huge by comparison with what you and I are familiar with. Now, we can easily check on this because you see they'd been prisoners for centuries where? Down in Egypt. So don't be surprised if you go to Egypt, you can see Semitic people painted on the walls. You know one thing you notice about them? They're not much different in size from anybody else, which leaves you with only one conclusion. It was either a bunch of big grapes or a big bunch of little grapes. Either way, it took 2 people to carry it. The Bible's an interesting book. Actually, let me ask another question. Is that reference to grapes a religious statement or an agricultural report? See, this isn't a religious book. This is a book on the history of religion, and it's a book on the history of grapes. And it says when grapes first started out, they were very good. And by the time you get to the land of Canaan, there's still some pretty impressive grapes. In fact, what else was in the land of Canaan that was impressive? Some of the people. Ah, interesting. Oh, and the Discovery Channel says the sharks used to be giants and now they're midgets. Look how much they've evolved. Now, I don't know if you've done a lot of work in science, but my background's sort of in coal geology and lecturing in geology and science, and I've been doing this sort of thing for the past 25 years, and I have discovered that the best lies are mostly the truth. They're the hard ones to pick. And so most of what you hear in the theory of evolution will be true. That's not the part you've got to worry about. Lies are like rat poison, as the old Southern Baptist preacher said. It's 99% good, wholesome porridge. That's not the part that hurts you, right? It's the part you didn't taste and didn't see. That's what got you. Okay, so the Bible says the world started out very good. It isn't good now. The world has changed. Agreed? But you go to the high schools, and in the textbook, guess what the definition of evolution is? Evolution is change. If evolution was true, it would be change. But if change is true, it's not necessarily evolution. Oh, this is an interesting fight that's going on here for the brains of Americans and all the people around the world. So what we're going to do is take you on what I'd normally do as a slideshow, but because of your setup here with this high-tech system, I have to stand out the front and get in the road of these guys. So I'll move backwards and forwards so they can see the pictures too. We're going to start out on the border of Canada and the USA. Yours truly, digging up a bone. We're on a dinosaur dig. By the way, when you find them, they don't look like that. That's what they look like after a lot of creative imagination. When I first saw these bones, here's what I spotted. And you don't pay for the cost of finding them. You pay for the months of digging them out and cleaning them up and gluing them back together again. It's interesting. You see, you don't have to spend too long digging before you reach the conclusion there was once a time when a plate of ribs was a big meal indeed. That's assuming you ate ribs in those days. And about 20 feet above the dinosaur bed, I found that. Now, can you see the Canadian coin there? It's about 1.5 times the size of your quarter. And the interesting thing is the press had heard about our dig and they came out to see what it was we were digging up. And there was one photographer there, he got really fascinated not by the dinosaur bones, but by this. And he said, I recognise that leaf, it still grows in Canada today, but it's only 1/5 of the size. Giant grapes, giant leaves, giants in the land, the Bible says. Actually, there are giants mentioned before Noah's flood too, aren't there? In Genesis chapter 6, in Numbers chapter 13. But I'm looking around the room and most of us are puny by comparison. And if you had grapes for lunch, they were more like ball bearings, weren't they? We don't live in a world where the grapes take 2 people to carry one bunch. Let's have a look in the land, literally, and on it. Do you see the Canadian flag there? You see the leaf? There'll be no politics in this lecture, thank you. Do you see the leaf that's on the tree? Today you buy these from the health food shop and pay a small fortune for them. When they fall off the tree, you can see where they got their name from. Can you see how it's split into 2 lobes? Okay, it's called ginkgo biloba. And it's a health food. And nobody ever stops to ask the question, how come great-great-grandpa didn't have health food shops? And why do we need more and more of them? In fact, you can see when you get up close to these leaves, they're usually only a couple of inches across. But you see, I run dinosaur digs and fossil trips all over the world. And the interesting thing is when you dig up fossil ginkgo leaves, they're 20 to 30 inches across. They used to be monsters. In fact, it seems like we've got a bit of a trend. And this is a little plant that I deliberately grow in my backyard. It's only about 1/8 to 1/4 inch across. You can see I've pulled the leaves off. You can see the stripes that are left behind on the stem. It grows to about 18 inches tall. You can still find it growing down in the Sequatchie Valley in Tennessee, where I've done a lot of research on the rocks and fossils. It's called a Tassel Fern. It's about 18 inches tall. Now, let me put this on front of one of the fossil tassel ferns I've dug up. Can you see the stripes on the fossil one? Can you see the stripes on the present day one? Tassel ferns used to be big, but how big? Let me show you one of the biggest ones that I've found. We're on the border of Tennessee and Kentucky. Can you see my geologist colleague Bob Powell at the bottom middle of the picture for scale? That's the stem of one of these plants that used to be over 100 feet tall. And the Bible says in Genesis 1 and 2 that God made everything very good, and most of us Christians today think in terms of morals only. No, this is good everything. Good weather, good food, good soil, good growth, good everything. Good morals as well. Well look, there are plenty of fossils in the ground. You do know what a fossil is, don't you? Please don't mention any lecturers by name. But the reality is FOSS is an old word. It simply means whole. And IL basically refers to what's in it. Now that's, well, you have to dig a hole to find a fossil. You can see the young girl's thumb for scale. Can you see that this is a different plant? It's got vertical stripes, but one horizontal bar. This is a different plant than the other one I just showed you. And you can call these things the fingerprints of the plants, if you like. They're a dead giveaway when you're digging them up as to what they are. Okay, now that's on Nova Scotian rocks that I found that one. Let's jump over the Atlantic to Lancaster in England. Can you see the British pound coin, which is about 2/3 of the size of your quarter? Can you see the same pattern, vertical stripes and horizontal bars? Now, I dug up that rock about 18 inches below the bottom of the slide you're looking at. And growing out of the ground right above it is a present-day version of the same plant. Now, it's called a Horsetail Rush. Can you see the tiny little horsey tail at the top? And today in the USA, they might get up to 3 feet tall. How big are the ones in the rocks? Well, have a look at this fossil. By the way, the fossil is the one in the middle. That's a Baptist pastor on the left-hand side. And while some of their congregations may refer to them as fossils, we'll just use him for scale at the moment. Horsetail rushes provably like tassel ferns used to be over 100 feet tall, and now they're midgets. Look how much they've changed. But you see, Genesis 1 and 2 says God made the world very good, and Genesis 3 says man sinned and the world went from good to bad in the bite of a piece of fruit. Isn't that true? That's a change, but it's not evolution. In fact, if we go one step further, we're back on the border of Tennessee and Kentucky again. Can you see my hand for scale? I'm up on a cliff. I spotted these about 30 feet above the base of the cliff, so I climbed up the cliff. And, well, I do hope you appreciate the trouble we go to get some of this evidence, because I'm on a narrow ledge and I've got my hand there for scale, and I'm holding my flash camera with the other hand and praying desperately about the rattlesnake that's just appeared between my legs. Interesting world. By the way, why was I worried about the rattlesnake? Because we don't live in a good world anymore. And you might be interested in finding out, well, what was a rattlesnake's poison for when the world was very good? You see, if you don't ask the right questions, don't expect the right answers, and the atheist will tell you it's evidence that if God made the world, he made bad things too. Now, there's a philosophical dilemma for you. Oh, can you see the fossil Horsetail Rush in the middle and the present day one right beside it? Stripes and bars, but they used to be giants. And it's not that museums don't know this. You see, here's a fiberglass mock-up of a giant Horsetail Rush that's fallen over. And beside it on the left-hand side is a present day, or is a baby giant Horsetail Rush, about 3 foot tall. Now, cast your eyes over the pictures. Can you see anything else interesting in the picture? Okay, there's some bugs there. Let's go a bit closer. Do you recognise this one? He's still here today, by the way. Let me introduce you to the world's biggest present-day cockroach. Meet my friend Goliath Cockroach. Okay. Who do you think he's named after, by the way? That's right. It's impossible to separate religion and science. Okay. This guy's several inches long. That means he's big enough so when you stand on him, the white stuff can come up between your toes. Okay? Yeah. But when you dig up the rocks, you find they're 40 to 50 times bigger. You have to shoo them out of the house with a broom once upon a time. And out of the same rocks you find mosquitoes with a proboscis 18 inches long and dragonflies with a wingspan 3 feet across. It's not that museums don't know this. You see, here's a mock-up of a dinosaur catching a dragonfly for lunch. In those days, the dragonflies were like miniature Air Force jets. You just didn't spray them with insecticide, you threw the can at them. Except you wouldn't have need to because the world was very good. And in a good world, the insects aren't a pest, so what on earth did mosquitoes eat? You see, there are many people who won't come to church because they think the Christians don't know answers to these questions, and the devil has thought of them. So therefore you need to as well. Oh, by the way, when you have a look at Genesis chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, Genesis 1 and 2, God made the world very good. Don't blame him for Saddam Hussein or Osama bin Laden or mosquitoes causing malaria, because everything he made was very good. Genesis 3 says man sinned, the world went downhill. Genesis 4 to 6 tells you the world went even further downhill. So God decided to do what? Wash it away with a flood, except for Noah and his family. Well, here's a flood-formed rock. You see my hammer for scale? There's a set of tracks I found on a bottom of a cliff face in Nova Scotia on the Bay of Fundy. Now, the interesting thing about tracks in rocks is that they only get formed if, number one, the rock is setting, and number two, it's covered up before they can be eroded away. So 8 times out of 10, if you follow these tracks long enough, you will find the animal that made them at the other end somewhere. So, ladies and gentlemen, found on both sides of the Atlantic, meet Big Bug. So well preserved, his food was still in his stomach. And we know what he is because he's still here. I took these pictures in Tennessee. Do you realise roly-polies used to be 10 to 12 feet long? Giant grapes, giant people, giant leaves, giant lizards. The world's an interesting place in what you dig out of the ground and read in the Bible, isn't it? Oh, and these things only are 1/2 inch to 1 inch long today. Now that's change, but it's not evolution. Well, you see, the devil's clever. He knows if he can convince you the world has changed and you think change is evolution. Therefore, if evolution is true, the Bible isn't. If the Bible isn't true, then you don't take any notice of the preacher and you end up in hell and you can't figure it out. Interesting, isn't it? The Bible warns you that the devil's very subtle. Okay, meet my friend the Great Australian Bite. This is one of our sharks. In fact, if you come to Australia, you can run a test and do some proving on this guy. It's great fun shark fishing, by the way, but please remember to take your Magnum 44. Catching them's easy. Killing them once you get them on board the boat's a different matter. Okay, now the interesting thing about sharks is, unlike you and unlike me, they never stop growing. Question, was that in your biology book? Because you see, aren't you glad they don't live long enough to get that big anymore? But then again, if the world was very good, what did sharks eat, and would they have bothered to attack Adam on his surfboard? See what I mean? If you don't ask the right questions, don't expect the right answers. And it's all there. You see, what we're trying to do in this lecture is not give you a whole list of fossils to remember. That's a waste of time. We're trying to give you God's glasses on the big picture, because you're in the middle of it, waiting for the other end to happen. Isn't that true? And you've got to preach to people who think the world started out as a molecule and it's evolved into professors who talk all about it, called evolution. Okay, let's have a look at the real change. Some people ask me when I come to the States, do I know the crocodile hunter? The answer is yes. He lives over the other side of the river, not far away from my mother-in-law, and I took this picture in his backyard. He owns a tortoise that I used to ride on when I was a little boy. It was born in 1830. That makes it 174 years old. Now, unlike you and unlike me and unlike your dog, tortoises never stop growing till the day they drop dead. So how big's a 174-year-old tortoise? Answer, big enough for you and me to ride on. And of course, not far away are their cousins, the turtles. And the turtles, provably, keep growing every day of their life. The older they get, the bigger they are. Or they slow down, but they just don't stop growing. Funny thing, they don't seem to live long enough to get as big as the ones you find in the rocks. Now, we've just had a dinosaur dig up in Montana, and we found giant turtle remains up there alongside the giant lizards. But I'll bet my bottom dollar when you go to the museums in Montana, they don't tell you about the giant turtles. Just the giant lizards, because they're spectacular and they're supposed to have evolved into birds. And yet, provably, the turtles have turned into turtles, but they're a lot less impressive than they used to be. Well, my hand for scale. Where are we? Cambridge University, England, which is not exactly a little backwater place. And I'm just about to give a lecture that afternoon and evening, and we're in the English-speaking world's oldest collection of fossils. The fossil you're looking at is a very famous one. Can you see the little shovel-shaped head? Can you see the short neck, the narrow shoulders, long body? People argued over what this was for ages, couldn't figure it out. Actually, I'm not surprised. Would you like to see it today in Tennessee? Shovel-shaped head, short neck, narrow shoulders, long body. Now that's unbelievable, isn't it? Except that you know very well that you started out as a single cell inside mum. And look at the size of you now. Wonder what would happen if it stopped somewhere in between. Now there's a thought. Okay, you see the Bible says in Genesis 1 and 2 that God made the world very good. In Genesis 3 man sinned, and even though sin came into the world, how long did people live up till Noah's flood? Well, Methuselah was 969. And after Noah's flood, Noah was the last person to live over 900. Arphaxad, he only lived 400. His sons lived 300. Job's died about then. Abraham, 175. Moses, 120. Anybody here 100? Pretty rare these days, isn't it? Oh, what are you looking at? A little ram's horn shell I found on the west coast of New Zealand. Can you see the grains of sand for scale? We're on a beach. Now, the interesting thing about this guy is he's got a clock built into him. Every year he grows, he adds chambers because he gets bigger. So you can count up the number of chambers and figure out how many growth spurts he's gone through, how many years he's grown. Okay, would you like to meet one of his cousins in the rock? Because this guy's about 1/2 inch across, but that guy's not. And if you count the chambers, you get up to 300, and we've lost the rest of him. And if that doesn't impress you, how about this one that a little girl found on a field trip to the cliffs not far from that beach? Now be honest, when was the last time it took two of you to carry home a seashell from the beach? Now let's ask, those of you who did biology, was this sort of thing in your textbook? Because it took me 20 years to dig all this stuff up. And it wasn't in my textbooks, and I used to lecture in geology, and it wasn't in those textbooks either. This is exactly the opposite of Charles Darwin's stuff. Oh, change it is. The change part is true. But the evolution isn't true at all. Devolution's probably a better word, and some have devolved so far they've become extinct. Okay, east coast of New Zealand. Can you see the coin? About 1.5 times the size of your quarter. Can you see the oyster shells on the rock, the black rock that the coin's on? Well, the waves are washing out the rock underneath and exposing a white fossil bed underneath the present-day oysters. Let's dig one out and discover that fossil oysters used to be giants. And the interesting thing is, oysters put a new ring on every year. Now, on everything we know in the present world, it's easy to prove that on that basis oysters lived a lot longer than they do today. But then if you're a Christian, that shouldn't surprise you, should it? How long did Methuselah live compared to your grandmother? I mean, most of you will not make it to 96. So the biblical picture is, there was a world that was very good, then it got slightly less than good, but it was still impressive enough to you to live to be 1,000. Question, how big would a 1,000-year-old shark be? Or if you haven't asked that question, you'll never bother to even look at the answer. And you'll call all this evolution when it's really exactly the opposite. In fact, to go on one step further, what on earth is a giant fiberglass mock-up of a kangaroo doing in an Australian tourist park looking down over the American tourists? Well, number one, he's trying to attract you inside to spend your tourist dollars. We're desperate for them in Australia. Number two, he's based on the facts. You see, on the right-hand side is a present-day giant grey as tall as me. On the left-hand side is a fossil kangaroo found 80 miles from my house. Do you notice a difference in size? Now, I wish I could say I'd found the biggest fossil kangaroo, but that wouldn't be true. The biggest one was found on the Nullarbor Plains in the southern part of Australia, and it's between 12 and 15 feet tall. By the way, this room is about 9 feet tall. Now that's a kangaroo. Of course, the interesting thing is, I've still got kangaroos living in my backyard. You can't make pets of them, they just don't stay in. The fences are just too expensive to make. But the fascinating thing is that unlike you and unlike me, but like the sharks and the turtles and the tortoises, guess what? They keep growing every day of their life. Now, in case you think there's a theme here, you're jolly right, there is. There's a pattern. In fact, there's two patterns of growth on this planet. There's creatures that don't keep growing and those creatures that do, and your textbook never talks about the ones that do growing. Well, on the left-hand side is the skull of a present-day goanna. These live in my backyard. I live out on the edge of the bush or the forest, as it's often called over here. And goannas where I live get to be about 3 or 4 feet long. And when my wife sees one coming through the bush, she goes, "Ah!" She's not too keen on these sort of things. You see the skull with the big teeth on the right-hand side? That was found near the fossil kangaroo. Goannas used to be 30 feet long. I wonder what my wife would say if she saw one of those coming towards her. Now, the world's an interesting place, but the world that's gone is even more interesting. And scientists do ask questions about it, and the Bible does tell you to test everything. So don't be surprised that the devil will throw up lots of barriers to stop you even thinking about the real history of the world. So if you visit most Christian bookshops, you can bet your bottom dollar 99% of the books will be devotional. And they won't be on the real history of the world at all. Of course, the problem is where you think you come from tells you who you think you are, which governs where you think you're going to. So if you've got the wrong belief about where you come from, you've got the wrong view of who you are and the wrong view of where you're going to. The devil knows that. We Christians need to know it just as well. In fact, scientists are always puzzled about where we came from. Okay, do you see our little lizard in the front there? This is a close-up because he's found in a spider's burrow. Such a tiny lizard. He's a pygmy blue-tongue lizard. And he gets the name blue-tongue lizard because guess what colour his tongue is? Excellent. Science is down to earth. But scientists puzzle about him because where I live on the coast, where it's pretty good climate, the plants are green all year, there's plenty of food, the blue-tongue lizards are quite large. But here's what the puzzle is. How come out in the outback, where there's hot heat and dry in the summer and cold and dry in the winter, how come the pygmy blue-tongue lizards are so tiny? And they've reached an answer which is probably right. There's just not enough food or water for the big ones. There's no place to hide in the heat or keep warm. So only the pygmy runts can survive. They call it natural selection, and everybody thinks that's evolution. Well, it's only half the truth. You see, the best lie is mostly the truth, and what they ignore is the biggest selection pressure that's ever occurred on the history of the planet. Genesis 8:22. God's talking to Noah. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. Question. Is that a religious statement or a weather forecast? See what I mean? And yet, one of the best weapons the devil has is to keep people thinking this is a religious book. It's a book about religion. It's a book about history. It's a book about murder. It's a book about rape. It's a book about pillage. It's a book about everything. And there's the problem. So is the theory of evolution. Marketplace competition. The devil's very smart at it. Okay, let's ask a question. What would that sort of a change do to creatures and environments on this planet? I mean, have you ever noticed that that's the first time the word cold is mentioned in the Bible? I mean, you should have figured that out. When God made the world, it was very good. And good covered climate as well. I mean, did Adam and Eve have any warm clothes on? What were they wearing? Nothing. Have you tried that around here in the middle of December? Right? How about in Colorado or in Alaska? Do you realise in the middle of summer around here you could die of heat exhaustion? They didn't even have a sunburn cream on or a hat. You see, good covered everything back there and now it's not good anymore. So let's do some practical questioning. There are 5 of us who do the research photography and creation research. I do the fossils, somebody else does the scenery, somebody does the people, and somebody else does the animals. On the day my colleague took this picture, how many snakes do you think attacked him? So obvious, isn't it? You see, there are no snakes in Alaska. If you want to find snakes, you've got to come as far south as British Columbia, and by the time you get to the USA border, well, I had to laugh. The first time they showed me a Canadian snake, it was a foot long. And coming from Australia, I'll be honest, I thought it was a garden worm. Because you see, the further south you go, the better the climate gets, the better the reptiles do, until by the time you get to Brazil or Australia, they're beginning to get decent. Right, I mean, in my backyard, we've got 10-foot long pythons and things like that, decent sort of snakes. And the interesting thing is, when you dig up the rocks, there are plenty of fossil snakes around, but it doesn't usually get in your textbooks that when you find the biggest fossil snakes, they're as big as those double-hitch trailers on the interstate. Aren't you glad they're not that big anymore? Snakes used to be monsters, and now they're midgets. And the Bible is emphatic that the things you and I are so used to are really the result of degeneration. I mean, when God made the world, good covered the seasons. Seasons are mentioned in Genesis chapter 1, but there was no extremes. After Noah's flood, there are extremes of seasons. In fact, it shows up in tree rings today, and when you dig up fossil trees alongside those giant mosquitoes and giant cockroaches, you're hard pushed to find any tree rings. I mean, come on my field trips to Tennessee and Pennsylvania. I'll be running a field trip in Pennsylvania later this year. We'll find you fossil trees, but they won't have any tree rings in them. When you have a look at the rocks and the fossils and you ask a question, what would the proof be that the world started out very good and then it went from good to not so good and then it went to worse and finally it ended up in Los Angeles? What would the evidence be? You see, Genesis chapter 2 has got a statement about the watering system. This is not a religious statement. It's a daily mist or the springs came up every day and watered the whole surface of the earth. Now, I'm from Australia, and some of my friends are farmers, and they'd give their right arm for a watering system like that. I mean, question, how much money do you think they'd have to spend on irrigation pipes in a world like that? They wouldn't. How much money would you have to spend on community dams? You wouldn't. What a good scheme this was. What a shame we blew it. I mean, this is more like your day to day, isn't it? I mean, if you think you've had a bad day, how do you think the little rodent feels there? And you and I, we look at that and we're so brainwashed we call it natural selection. Well, you see, you put God's glasses on and a better word would be unnatural selection. Because the snake was a vegetarian. What on earth is venom for if you're going to eat a pumpkin? How come they made the change? You see, Charles Darwin asked these questions and nobody gave him any answers, and you know the end result. And there are many theologians who ask these questions and nobody gives them an answer. In the end, they become abject liberals who don't believe anything in the Bible. You do realise, I'm sure you tell them every year, sir, the Bible does tell you to have a reason for what you believe, particularly concerning the hope that lies within you, and that hope is Christ. And the interesting thing is, Christ is recorded as the Creator. You've got to have a reason for what you believe about Christ as Creator. Let's go to New Zealand. There's my mate Ralph Burrell, originally from England, very brave chap, sneaked up behind this 12-foot long brass model of a fossil tuatara and grabbed it by the rear end. Do you think he would have done that if it was alive? I mean, look at those claws. Now, a couple of interesting points. This is a one-for-one model based on a fossil found in Germany. Because why is it in Invercargill, New Zealand, on the extreme southern part of the island? Answer, because it's the only place in the world where tuataras live. And of course, we're used to words like indigenous creatures, and that's political green rubbish. There is no such thing as a native creature. All you've got left is these midget survivors that used to live all over the place. And now New Zealand's the only part of the world where you find them. Oh, they grow to a magnificent 18 inches at 100 years of age. Oh, are you thinking? I hope so, because if at 100 they're 18 inches long, how old was a 12-foot long one? And you only get the answers to the questions that you ask. And the average person never asks these questions. Of course, it's a good technique when you're evangelising to turn their questions around on them and ask them straight back. This is what Jesus did, because most people use questions to hide behind. And all you need to do to expose them is to ask them to give you their answer to that question they may have asked, and then you throw a few in, like Jesus did with the woman at the well. Actually, let's keep going a little bit further. Do you remember when this was on the front page of most world papers about 3 or 4 years ago? Well, if you don't, I did. I took a copy of it. And the geologist was boasting he'd found a fabulous fossil crocodile. Can you see the present day one in the middle of the big jaws? Well, present day crocs get sort of 12 to 25 feet long. And he said, I found a monster. This was 40 feet long. Well, I've got to be honest, I wasn't impressed, because I've seen some of the big ones. You see, on the right-hand side is a fossil crocodile. I live in a country where there are crocodiles. The crocodile hunter is far more popular over here than he is in Australia, because you can go and play with your own crocodiles in Australia if you want to. Okay? And the one thing we do know is that they grow pretty fast for the first 25 years of their life. And then they slow down. But they never stop growing. In the next 70 years, they're liable to grow another 3 or 4 feet, but then they get to be about 100 and they drop dead around about 20 to 25 feet long. You see the big fella in the picture? He was found over here in North America, and he was 52 feet long. And now the world record is 54 feet long. By the way, what word would come into your mind if you saw a 54-foot long crocodile that was 12 foot tall at the shoulder coming towards you? I mean, apart from help. You think of what sort of a saurus you would actually imagine. You see, they are sauruses, or didn't that get mentioned in your biology book either? They are in the Archaeosaurus group. The dinosaurs are extinct, but the sauruses are still here, plenty of them. But these guys are nowhere near as impressive as they used to be, so you want to know what happened to many of these big monsters. I'll give you a couple of thoughts. And don't write this bit into your church membership statement, but this is interesting to ponder about. You see, we dig up many giant skulls with our arrowheads and spearheads in them. Beyond a shadow of a doubt. You want to know what happened to the giant buffaloes? The American Indians did them in. Giant muskox, the same. You want to come to Europe, the giant oxen? There you are. You're looking at it. We killed them. You want to know what happened to the giant moa birds in New Zealand? The Maoris ate them out of existence. What happened to the dodo bird? Same thing. The Europeans killed it off, hit it on the head and ate it, every last one of them. In fact, I've got a suspicion that when you ask what happened to the dinosaurs, the same story is true. I mean, you can read the book of Job and there's an interesting version of a fire-breathing monster in there, and Job is asked 3 questions. Could you catch it? Could you tame it? Could you kill it? No, no, no. And of course, how would you know the answer to those 3 questions? Somebody has tried. Okay, but you've got a statue here of St. George killing the dragon. And if you know anything about English history, St. George was allegedly a Roman soldier who became a Christian around about 300 AD, and he's famous for rescuing fair maidens in distress from fire-breathing dragons. Isn't that the story? And he won and the dragons lost. But have you noticed several things? Dragons always look like dinosaurs. And in fact, when you have a look at the dragons in the pictures, have you always noticed that they're smaller than St. George's horse? Don't be surprised. By the time of St. George, people were living 70 years. They used to live 700 and 1,000. And so did the lizards and the reptiles. They were monsters. But a 70-year-old reptile's nothing to be scared of. We've got plenty of them in Australia. Last interesting point about dragons. Do you know what the first word was that scientists used for dinosaur before they invented the word dinosaur? Quote unquote from Richard Owen, they were on the Isle of Wight to discuss the discovery of the new dragons. They used that word. It's now politically incorrect, but that shouldn't deter you from sticking to the truth. We called them dragons, first time we dug them up. And if you want to know why we killed some of them, here is my suspicion. You see, God made the world very good. Does anyone remember what everybody ate? Plants. What did the animals eat? Genesis 1:29, man ate the plants. Genesis 1:30, animals ate the plants. That's why the world was very good. Nothing was killed in the struggle to survive because there was no survival of the fittest. That's all post-Noah's flood. Come Noah's flood, of course, and you got winter. Question, if you're a 60-foot-long, 20-ton plant-eating creature and winter's around and all the leaves have fallen off the trees, what are you going to eat? Of course, if you've got sharp teeth, you may have an option, mightn't you? All right? Or, of course, God told Noah in Genesis chapter 9. In fact, go to Genesis chapter 9 and have a look at it. Read verses 1 to 6 for yourselves. You see that God is amending the dietary regulations. He tells man that he's permitted to eat what? He's permitted to eat the creature that moves, just as he gave man permission to eat the green things. God is doubly defining this. You know, you can't get confused here. There may be some green lizards, but the difference between a lizard and a cabbage is you don't have to ambush the cabbage, right? So he doubly defines it as creatures that move. But he doesn't permit us to eat what? Blood. Okay, we won't go into that at the moment, but it's a very important thing you need to notice. But then he also tells us that we must take the life of a man who murders. So God has no problem with the death penalty. But then you wouldn't expect that. He passed the death penalty for eating the wrong sort of fruit, didn't he? His standards are much higher than ours. But when you read that little regulation, by the time you get to verse 6 and his rule on not killing people, what's his rule about animals that attack us? Did you notice? If they kill somebody or they hurt somebody, what are we permitted to do? Kill them, okay? In other words, we have authority to hurt them and kill them. They have no authority to hurt us or kill us. Now, you want to disagree with this rule, you have to take up with God. I'm not in a position to negotiate this one. In reality, God authorised the killing of animals who would become vicious. Now, don't be surprised. Have you ever thought of what we needed to invent to start eating meat? I mean, there was no McDonald's around the edge from the ark, right? You had to do something. You just don't sneak up behind a cow and take a bite. Isn't that true? Cows object to this. So what have you got to invent? Anybody? Weapons. Weapons. And, you know, I tell you what, animals aren't dumb. If you start throwing things at them, they'll do one of two things. They'll run away or they'll run at you. And if you've got sharp, pokey things, some of them have got them too. And all those nice big horns that God gave Triceratops for pushing over palm trees so it could rip the leaves and the bark to shred and eat them, and we know that's what it did with them. Guess what it now discovers it can use them for? Stick them in them nasty people who are throwing sharp things at it. So don't be surprised, that little illustration here shows people running away from these nasty critters. And we've been killing them ever since. Of course, now we're sinners. We may have God's word, but we no longer have the wisdom to necessarily use it rightly. We nearly killed off many creatures that weren't even a threat to us. Isn't that the truth? I mean, I was amazed when I saw this one first come out of the rocks in Canada. The present day version of this creature is only as big as its jaw used to be. Do you realise beavers used to be 10 to 12 feet long? And by the way, if beavers were giants, can you imagine the size of the trees they chewed on? And if the trees used to be giants, can you imagine the size of the vines that grew on the trees? In fact, the interesting thing is you find some big people too, or didn't they tell you that? Ah, fascinating. And don't be surprised some of the people were big. Look at the size of the sheep they had to shear. Or wasn't that in your agricultural science course either? You see, the best way to distort the truth is simply not to tell it all. Isn't that true? You don't even have to tell lies to tell a lie. Just leave out the most important bits. In fact, we occasionally find giant people, even today. Isn't that the case? Well, here's a couple of giants I ran across, or at least I ran across the evidence of them. I preached in the church they went to in Kentucky. Now, do you see that little fellow on the right-hand side? He's a normal you and me. And the guy in the middle is his brother, literally. Mum and Dad were normal. Look at the brother. What a monster. And look at the woman. I mean, how would you like to meet her in a dark lane one night? They were huge. And they got married. And I got the family lawyer who had the records to certify it all and send it to me along with the photographs so I could use it. And the interesting thing is they had a baby. Third line up from the bottom, on the right-hand side, the baby weighed 22 pounds. 22 pounds. Ouch. Just as well as no ladies in the class, hey? And that's a big baby. Sad news is it died shortly after. Of course, you don't have to do too much study to discover that over a certain birth weight, babies' chances of survival in the present world drop off very rapidly. And you don't have to do too much more study to discover that most giants today don't have babies. They're sterile. In fact, most giants today will not get married because they know their doctor has told them they're going to be dead by the time they're 35. Giants just don't do well today. But when they did, so did the grapes. I mean, there's where we started, isn't it? And that's not a religious statement, that's an agricultural report. The Bible is a history of everything. And the devil wants us to stop seeing it. It's got a bit about rain, it's got water, it's got food, it's got law, it's got religion, it's got all sorts of things in it. And look, when the grapes were impressive, do you remember Goliath? He was one of the last of them, wasn't he? Did you know he had brothers and sisters? Most people don't because they've only read the Golden Book version of David and Goliath for kids. Okay? And his brothers and sisters were deformed, 6 fingers, 6 toes on at least one of them. Now, what does this tell us? Well, number one, if Goliath had brothers and sisters, mum and dad were not infertile, correct? Secondly, if there were brothers and sisters, they lived long enough to have quite a few children, right? In fact, this was from a long line of giants. But you notice the deformities? They're already on the way down. And it's not too long after the days of David that you don't read about them anymore. Giants today, most of them can't even have children. They don't do very well in this world. Now, we've been working on this project for 20 years, so we could go on for hours, but I've got to stop. I want you to get the big picture. You see, if you're taking notes, that's what you want to type down. The rest has just been the froth and bubble to get you interested in the point. I mean, it's interesting too, but have a look at that, write it down, and then I'll talk about it for a little bit. Just to avoid a crush at the end, we might get you to separate them out. Leave separate piles. Okay, so let's just go over that quickly and then we should have some good time for questions. Genesis 1 and 2, God made the world very good. It's a very important theological statement. It qualifies forever that if you want to know what's wrong with this world, you can't blame God. Genesis chapter 3 says, look in a mirror. We are the problem. Okay, Genesis 1 and 2, God made the world good. Genesis 3, we sinned. The world went downhill. By the time you get to Genesis chapter 4, death is introduced. The wages of sin is death. By the time you get to Genesis 5 and 6, man's sin has become so obnoxious, God has made a judgment on the planet, leaving only Noah and his family alive, and the environment has been done in like a dinner. I mean, all those plants that were growing in the first world that God created, they were growing in created soil. So guess what the mineral balance was like? It was very good. It was the best you could get, right? So you could get everything you needed out of your soya beans, and even broccoli and cabbage and Brussels sprouts tasted good. It's hard to believe, I know, but that's the reality of it. Now, Noah's flood. Have you ever thought what that would have done to the soil and the lovely mineral balance that was made to be perfect? I'm sorry, from now on, it's in one direction only. Permanent vegetarianism on this planet is practically doomed without a lot of extra help. Okay, so after Noah's flood, you've got a ruined environment, and after Noah's flood, your lifespan drops. The food isn't as good. I mean, it's easy to see the effect of this. Come with me to Alaska. I've just been out on a dinosaur dig in Alaska, and you go out in the wilderness on the tundra where it's pretty cold, and you meet the native Inuits. Guess what their lifespan is? 45 years. Bring them down to Seattle, give them warm food, warm clothing, warm shelter, and they'll live as long as you do. Hard climate ruins your lifespan. Being eaten by a shark shortens it quite considerably. You see, without that, life is much easier. After Noah's flood, your lifespan drops and the degeneration has continued down to the present. If you want to run a test on this, question, is diabetes on the increase or the decrease? It's on the increase. How about asthma? Increase or decrease? Yeah. Yep. The interesting thing is, how about allergies? Increase. In fact, if you wanted to take your Bible seriously, you can predict we are going to see new diseases occurring on this planet in the next 20 years that we have never seen before, and you didn't even need to know that because you've seen 3 in your lifespan. Mad cow disease, SARS, and AIDS. Never been around before. And it's not because God is creating them. It's not because the bugs are evolving. It's largely because guess what's happening to everything? it's running downhill. You're running downhill. Your relationship to the bugs is running downhill. Everything is falling apart. Or as Paul puts it, the whole creation has been subject to frustration, so that you will never be content with living on this planet for too long, even if Mr. Kerry gets elected. Hey! Oh, sorry, I shouldn't have brought that in. Okay, now what's the significance of this? It's not simply so we can talk about big fossils and little fossils. That's just the bait on the hook. Here's the significance. Go to John's Gospel, chapter 5. I'm sure you'll get this in your theology class. We could have picked a few other verses, but this is a good summary. Have a look at the last 2 verses of John's Gospel, chapter 5. Verse 46 and 47. Jesus is the author, and Jesus is talking to his enemies, and he said, if you really believe Moses, you'd believe me, for he wrote of me. But if you don't believe what Moses wrote, how can you believe what I say? Now, you have heard of Moses, haven't you? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. What's the subjects? The creation of the world, good. The fall into sin, God's judgment upon sin, the law of God by which you can determine whether you're a sinner or not. Get rid of all that, and you don't believe me, says Jesus. Now, do you notice that your Bible tells you about a spiritual being called Satan, who is and has been what from the beginning? A liar. A liar is someone who turns the truth around to their own benefit. Isn't that true? Question, the devil's been around a lot longer than you. Has he ever caught Jesus out at telling a lie? Never. So on his experience, he knows that anything Jesus says is true, correct? Okay? You're the devil. You're reading John's Gospel. It doesn't matter whether you're reading it NIV or KJV or any version or per version. He's read them all. Guess what he just heard Jesus say? If I can stop the people of California believing Moses, I can stop them believing who? I've got Jesus' guarantee on it. And that's really what this issue was all about. It's got very little to do with the fossils, because the fossils don't help the theory of evolution. They're the biggest obstacle to it. They do the opposite of what Charles Darwin says. It's all to do with Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. It's all to do with what Moses wrote. It's all to do with the fact that if you can stop people believing the first bit of the Bible, the last bit is irrelevant. I mean, make it simple for you. What's God's solution to the problem? John 1 and 2, the good God became a perfect man, correct? Okay, John 3, for God so loved the... you see, the perfect man who didn't sin, and if you don't sin, you shouldn't die. Isn't that true? Bible teaches death isn't a necessity, it's a moral penalty. And if Jesus didn't sin, he shouldn't have died. In fact, didn't he say, you can't take my life from me? Which means you can't kill somebody who hasn't sinned. He gave his life up for us. So if he didn't sin and yet he did die, was he dying for his own sin? Whose sin was he dying for? Ours, right? Oh, so the good God became a good man who didn't sin, who did die, so therefore he was dying in your place. And if you by faith accept that, question, what does he promise you? A new heavens and a brand new environment. How long will you live for? Forever. Will there be any more sorrow? Any more suffering? Any more death? Any more taxes? Now that's a good idea, don't you think? And we could go on and on and on. But you see, one last commercial. If you haven't written it down, well, you don't need to. If you're interested, you can either fill in that form and give it back to me today, or you can go to the web and lock on. We have a print news every couple of months in the USA, but the email comes out every couple of weeks because it's so efficient to do it that way. So I'd recommend that to you. And don't forget, before you leave here, if you want to pick up a free documentary of the stuff that's over there, or in lieu of a DVD, a CD-ROM encyclopedia on the subject, and a free copy of one of these brochures, which I'll now put back over here. I'll leave these all up at this end. Feel free to do so and be grateful to a businessman in Nashville. Okay, has anybody got any questions on what we've just done? Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's my understanding that they found also big dinosaur eggs. And do like a big lizard, would it have big eggs? And if so,
okay, big is a relative term. Give me your definition of a big dinosaur egg.
Basketball.
Like a basketball. No, there are no dinosaur eggs as round as basketballs. The biggest ones are long and skinny. Okay, and so the biggest dinosaur egg is about that big. But the biggest dinosaur egg is nowhere near as big as the biggest bird's eggs. Okay, because we dig up giant birds as well, and we've still got emus in Australia with, eggs half the size of basketballs, and the elephant eggs, which are still found from recently extinct elephant birds, are huge, bigger than dinosaur eggs. So the interesting thing is that most creatures, no matter what size they reached, always started out tiny. Okay, so the biggest baby dinosaurs were about this big. That's really what it tells you. Most of the dinosaurs were about that big, same size as baby crocodiles. So, when you're worrying about Noah having them on the ark, he had 2 Apatosaurus in this pocket and 2 T-Rexes down here. They all started out cute and tiny. It's just the size that they reached that was impressive, not the size. They always, no matter what size they reached, they always had the same size eggs, and they always were born at the same size. Yes?
What arguments do evolutionists advance who actually do try to interact with the decrease in size issue?
Well, you heard the best example. Look how much the sharks have evolved. The general trick of the trade is to call all change evolution. And to say if evolution is true, well, you'd expect all sorts of change, right? But in reality, there is only one change occurring around you in the present. If you leave the world by itself, physicists discovered this ages ago. If you leave the world by itself, your bed doesn't get made, does it? What happens to the car? It rusts. Well, in biology, the same principle applies. You leave things to themselves and they go in that direction. At the very best, they will stay there. They never do that. Of course, we're now capable of genetic engineering, but that's with us playing God. Okay, so anything we achieve with genetic engineering is evidence of creation, no help to naturalistic evolution at all. And the problem with most genetic engineering is we're smart enough to do it and not wise enough to know when we shouldn't. Okay, that's the biggest problem. So in playing God, we usually prove ourselves a little devil.
A lot of the pictures you showed, which are just remarkable, they're big, they're living counterparts are small. And just thinking back to my days of history with high school and even some of the college, those pictures showed a remarkable resemblance. Even though it was larger, you could definitely see the clear pattern in the living fossil today. But a lot of times it seems like these evolutionists are doing a switch game, and they show you this object, and they show you here's related, and there's a real stretch of imagination. So the question I guess I'm asking is, in this size and shape change, and is it consistent across the board that fundamentally the parts should resemble each other?
Well, if you start first of all where science started, you remember Carl von Linné, the man who invented the classification system, words like genus and species. Okay, they don't usually tell you in biology that Carl von Linné was an evangelical Lutheran and he invented the classification system in order to cope with God's creation. Okay, we were using all sorts of words like crawdad versus shrimp versus all sorts of things, and he wanted to standardise that. So he made use of concepts like species because he believed in creation. In fact, he believed in special creation. Special, species, same word, right? So species is a remnant from the fact that biology grew out of a creationist framework. And basically his line was, you can recognise where creatures are because you add up all the things they've got in common, take away the things that are different, you'll end up with them in roughly separate boxes. And you do. Now the evolutionist plays a nice little trick. He says, if I arrange them in ascending order of complexity, I've got a family tree. No, you haven't. You've just got your ability to arrange things in a specific order. In fact, as I like to tell people, one of the things that finally convinced me that evolution was false, I'm basically in third year university, and we had a textbook by Professor Carter from Cambridge University. It had all these lovely diagrams like you're talking about, the ones in the school textbooks. And then at the end, he would have a little analysis of all the data. And, he's from Cambridge, so he really did his stuff very well. And he said, here's the evidence, here is the diagrams, how the fishes evolve limbs from fins and all of that. And then at the end of the chapter he said, but you can't see this in the rocks. Well, that's fine. If there's one exception, not a problem. But after 50 chapters, and every chapter says, but you can't see this in the rocks. And then he gives you a summary, which I learned off by heart, that said, once a creature appears, it is for all practical purposes inherently stable. question. What would the evidence be that God created creatures to produce their own kind? Answer, once they've appeared, no matter how they got into the rocks, they would be inherently stable. And that's what they are. That's the world you live in. So it is a trick of using illustrations that arrange. It's like arranging everything from a scooter up to a Mercedes and calling it evolution, and Reader's Digest does exactly that. But it isn't. Every one of those separate objects is unrelated, and we created them all. You can arrange them in an ascending order, but it's got nothing to do with the reality of the history of any of them. That's the trick that's actually used in there. You'll find quite a bit of that's in that biology pamphlet, and if you go to a website and click on web books, there's several other pamphlets that can be downloaded that deal particularly with the fossil evidence there.
From your dig and all that, you pretty much can say consistently there's always the same obvious resemblance pattern from the big ones to the living ones.
You will find that those creatures that change size as they grow, you see, human beings don't. You and I sort of grow until we're 13 or 14 or 15, then there's a little clock in our head that turns us off. From then on, we grow in this direction, courtesy of Dairy Queen, right? And Sonic and some of these other sort of places. But in reality, there is another growth pattern on the planet, and it occurs in creatures who don't have to hold their own weight up. So whales never stop growing. Whales are the biggest creatures on the planet today, and they've always been the biggest creatures, right? They have not changed from beginning to end, and they're still huge. What you'll find is the size change is most obvious on the land creatures, where winter and summer is far more dramatic than it is in the oceans. But the creatures who don't keep changing size as they grow, their size is much more moderate. I'm sort of pretty sure that Noah was bigger than us, but not disproportionately as the crocodiles were. See, crocodiles can be 2 or 3 times their present day size. You and I may be 1 1/4 times. You dig up Cro-Magnon, he's up there. But that's nowhere near the same proportion as crocodiles or some of these things that we find in the rocks. But when we were up on our dinosaur dig in Montana, what amazed the people who'd never been out one of these digs before is they dug up a fish and it looked like a fish, right? They dig up a tree and it looks like a tree. They find a bit of fruit. Hey, I recognise that. That's a fig, right? And there is nothing that, I keep encouraging Christians, when Jesus said the rocks would cry out his praises, take that literally. The rocks do not applaud Charles Darwin or Discovery Channel or Reader's Digest or the public education system at all. They cry out the praises of Christ as Creator, as Lord, and as Judge, and never back away from it. That's why you want to say, show me the fossils. You won't get any. Up the back, yes.
In my studies, I found that a lot of the creationist models that explain the fossils we see today appeal to, as you did, the Noahic flood, and therefore a change in weather patterns and oxygen, and also, of course, the fall. Therefore, we have bad mutations in the genetic makeup, but it's always left kind of a bit ambiguous. I know you only have a little bit of time, but maybe you could explain, okay, some of the mechanisms that would actually cause for those things. In other words, some of the aspects of the flood that would actually produce these changes. In other words, it's like...
In other words, what would cause a thing to get smaller? Is that what you're asking me?
Yeah, for example, okay, so we say God flooded the earth. This is an example of the idea. Well, why has the flood got to be so tumultuous, for example? I'm talking about the geography of the earth. I mean, when I fill my bathtub up, right, it's very tumultuous in the beginning, but after a while it's pretty calm. Just by analogy, why is a flood a scapegoat sort of answer for everything? And if it is, then can we show it really is? And so I'm just looking for answers to why the flood is such an answer to everything.
Okay, let's remember that the scientist has 2 choices. He can put on God's glasses and try and use that as the framework of history, and he'll do so by faith, or he can put on Charles Darwin's glasses, who wasn't there, or Charles Lyell, or Richard Attenborough, or whatever, and try and use that as the framework by faith. Okay, so the first choice is which faith, where your faith is going to be directed. Okay, so there's your first choice. Let's use a biblical set of glasses. Genesis chapter 1, God made the world very good. Any recorded death in that world? Okay, if there's no death, think how the first geologists would have thought, because surprise, surprise, most of the first geologists were clergymen. And they were very successful. Okay, question, would they have thought any fossils formed before Genesis 1:31? No. Okay, so what could have formed before Genesis 1:31? Answer, all the rocks that God made and all the soil that God made, correct? That's all. So therefore, they invented the geologic column based on the big picture. The first era of rocks was the primary rocks, the rocks from creation. Okay, question, when could a fossil form? Answer, only after death is possible, correct? There are no live fossils, even though there are living fossils, right? Which is a technical word introduced by Charles Darwin to describe a creature that, for all practical purposes, hasn't changed. Okay, so the fossils are possible after death is on the planet. So after death is on the planet, you can only become a fossil. First of all, you can die, but in order to become a fossil, you have to be removed from the ecosystem before anything else can destroy you. So if you go out and dig up great-great-grandpa, he is not a fossil. In fact, he's not in good shape at all, right? You'll find his head bone has gone up next to his neck bone, and all his parts are fallen apart. That's because we didn't keep the worms and the bugs away from him. So when you find a fossil, you have to meet a certain set of criteria. And the best way of forming a fossil is rapid burial, which excludes oxygen to a depth that will exclude all other bugs and biological activity. If you don't achieve that status, you won't have anything significant as a fossil. You may preserve the framework of a skeleton, which is made out of minerals, but that's not quite the same thing. So between creation and the first rain, the first geologists said, well, there's not much likelihood of any fossils. Perhaps preserved coral reefs, because they've got a framework now of lime, because creatures can die. But no fishes, because if they fall to the bottom dead, what are the other fishes going to start to do to them? Eat them up. That's what they do today. Or if even the fishes don't, they'll dissolve in the water and disappear. So the first geologists said, therefore, the secondary period of rock formation had to start with the first rain. First rain, first erosion. First erosion, first mud. First mud that was fast enough to bury things before the bugs get at them has to date from the 40 days and 40 nights of Noah's flood. Okay? So that's where the logic originated in that. So they called those rocks the secondary rocks. And then they said, well, after Noah's flood, things calmed down for a bit. There's a few catastrophic exceptions like Joshua's long day and a couple of other hints of catastrophic events in Scripture, but we weren't watching. So from the end of Noah's flood up to the time they investigated the rocks firsthand in the 16 and 1700s, they called that the tertiary period. And then the rocks we've watched form, like at Mount St Helens or on the beaches in the Bahamas or whatever, are called the Quaternary rocks. Now, two of those words still survive in our modern geologic column, Quaternary and Tertiary, but they never tell you they came out of a biblical worldview. Okay, and as to why would they think about rocks and fossils associated with Noah's flood, the answer is simple. Go to 2 Peter chapter 3 and have a look at verses 4, 5, 6 and 7, and you'll soon find out. The biblical description of the flood is not the one that's in the children's book that describes the rain came, the rain went away, Noah came out and the bird flew off and everybody lived happily ever after. Amen. You see, when you do, I'm assuming these theological students will be doing Greek and all this sort of stuff. 2 Peter is a very fascinating comment on the flood and creation, and it's totally different from the Big Bang Theory or anything we see on television. In verse 5 of chapter 3, he says, for the people in the end times are willingly ignorant that by the word of God the heavens were of old and the earth stood out of the water and in the water, and that world that then was overflowed with water, and it perished. And my reference to my Greek concordance here is 6:2:1, which you'll find is cataclysmos. It's an abject destruction of the planet. It is meant to just wipe it out, so that by the end of the 40 days there is nothing living. This is a fast process. 40 days, the water covers the highest hills to a depth of, sort of 15 cubits above the highest bit that was left then. But here's what most people don't begin to realise. What was happening during the flood? Number one, when Noah went into the ark, does anyone remember how long it was before it started to rain? 7 days. And on the seventh day, the fountains of the deep broke open. You see, Peter says the world that was formed out of water. Noah's flood was the second time the world was covered in water. Creation was the first. And all that water went underneath between creation and Noah's flood, and now it's pouring out again. So the foundation of that block of land that everybody's living on, including the kangaroos, the tuatara lizards, and anything else that has to walk to Noah's Ark, is now going to be smashed to pieces. The water is pouring out from underground just as it's coming down in 40 days and 40 nights of rain. So number one, it's being destroyed from below at the same time as it's being eaten away from above. Okay, now what most people don't realise then is that the water kept on rising for 110 days after the rain stopped. So there's a lot more water for the flood coming from underneath, and hence it's just literally destroying the fabric of planet Earth, providing horrendous quantities of material that can cover and bury anything. But okay, I've left out one thing. Can anybody think of what I've left out? You're going to have unbelievable chaos from the water, but there's something else that's going to begin to organise things quite nicely, actually. It goes away, but that's going to be chaotic, because if you read Psalm 104, it says the Lord lifted up the mountains, he sank down the valleys, and the water ran off. That's chaos, particularly if it's going to occur in the last few months of the flood. Anybody? Well, there'll be that as well. Tell me what's happening every day, twice. Yeah, the sun and the moon are pulling the water around the planet. Do you realise how far up this planet is around? 25,000 miles. That's happening twice every day. And there is nothing better at sorting water into layers than sorting mud into layers than moving water. In fact, what we've discovered in the past 10 or 20 years is that water does not do what you're taught in the classroom. You remember the old experiment? They got a glass, they shook it up with mud and sand and that in it, and it all settled out into layers, and teacher said, there, that's how the rocks form. Which, as I love to tell people, would be a wonderful experiment if the world was a glass of water. But it isn't. You see, in the real world, and I remember my fourth year or third year professor saying to me, we've got a problem, lads, that in the rocks in the Grand Canyon it gets old sideways, implying that the rocks were being laid down as they went. We now know that's exactly what happens to them. Rocks don't get laid down one on top of the other at all. Ask a plumber. You know, the water is running through the pipe. The bit around the edge is actually going slower than the bit in the middle. It's already in layers inside. Water is behaving like little ball bearings, running over the top of one another. If you watch the movie Hunt for Red October, you saw this. What was the captain looking for? Layers. There are lots of layers, and you just see water. But the layer here is going that way, this layer is going that way, there's another layer, and you get in those layers, and everything in there is behaving differently than everything up here. So the water itself is actually already sorted out into layers. And the fact that it's going around the world twice a day and will continue to do this, you know, with probably a global impact for several centuries after the land is lifted up at the end of the flood. We tend to think, the rain stopped, that's the end of the flood. No, it didn't even stop in its impact, I'm sure, when all the land dried out. Because now you've got winter and summer, and you've got a wet season, you've got a dry season, and you've got a land which has just been lifted up out of the water. Tell me how much erosion you're going to get next time it rains. It's going to be incredible. We know this because we've watched it happen in places like Australia and New Zealand, where we went in and we foolishly chopped down all the trees. There is one valley in New Zealand where the British went in, cleaned out the trees, built a lovely community, a nice schoolhouse, and guess what happened? They chopped the trees down and it rained. That schoolhouse is now 125 feet underneath the surface of the ground. That's only, a century. And it's just rainfall very quickly. So those sort of effects are the dominant ones that are involved in rapid burial. If you look around you at the moment, here is the contradiction that most geologists should see if they had their glasses off and were looking at the real world God made. You saw millions of living things today, didn't you? And for every one living thing, there's a dead thing, correct? It will die. How many fossils did you see today that were forming? None. The world that you live in does not make fossils. What happens to the dead things? They disintegrate. The worms eat them, all right? That's what happens to them. So in the normal world, fossilization is impossible. So unless you're going to get something cataclysmic, catastrophic, then you are not going to have fossils. Secondly, in case you're wondering why it fits so nicely Noah's flood, let me describe the geology of North America for you in generic terms. If you start, say, underneath Nashville, 3,000 feet down, you've got granite. The granite goes up and up and up. By the time you get to 60 miles south of St. Louis, it pops out of the ground a bit, then it goes back under, pops up on the other side of St. Louis, and then it's totally bare when you get up on the Canadian Shield. As you come back down, first of all, there's gravels on it from the glaciers, then underneath it there's limestone. That limestone goes from there all the way down through Tennessee and across to Australia, over to eastern Russia. By the way, this is a big bed of limestone. And you've got sandstones that do the same thing. In fact, when you get down to, I flew over the Grand Canyon today, which is technically on fire. It's full of bushfires over there at the present time. But the bottom layer in the Grand Canyon, and I've walked that Grand Canyon many times, is a pure quartz sandstone. And it is a global bed. Okay, question. What's it sitting on? It's sitting on a granitic rock that's been cleaned off by water, and the grains of sand have come from that granite, and they've been washed from other places where the granite pops up above the ground. So we know that this has been a globe which has been eroded by water to the bottom, and then it's been filled in by sediment progressively. And I don't think, when we look at the flood, don't stop at the end of the flood. That's where God's judgment stopped. The consequences will go on for centuries, including the planet restabilising itself. And if that doesn't make any sense to a non-geologist, think this way. You lift up land. The rain erodes it. When you erode, say, a foot of soil from here and shift it over here, do you know how much a foot of soil weighs? Now 125 feet. That used to be over on that mountain. It's now over here. The land goes, and what do you call that? An earthquake. You have them all here, right? So these destabilised zones are a long-term consequence of Noah's flood. But the effects are so tiny today, we're hardly seeing any fossil formation at all. We did see some off the coast of California a few years back. You had one earthquake and a whole cliff collapsed. Pretty messy, but it buried a bed of seaweed, a bed of kelp. Within 5 years, because it had been totally buried in the absence of air, guess what it was? Not just fossil, it was medium-grade diesel oil. Okay? So you don't need millions of years to make oil, you need rapid burial of plants and animals. Okay, and if you don't have the rapid burial in a catastrophic event, you won't get fossils or oil. But you see your oil beds in the USA go from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border. Now that's impressive. Something buried quadrillions of animals so quickly they didn't have time to rot before they were buried. So that's the connection.